In this lesson, we are going to continue to further explore appropriate principles and guidelines in place to establish user domain policies. In this lesson, we'll start off by focusing our attention on acceptable use policy. And so it's important that organizations have an acceptable use policy because an AUP helps to set clear expectations about how technological assets that belong to the organization should be utilized by all employees and stakeholders. An acceptable use policy is going to define how computers and networks can be used appropriately without violating any company policies. So specifically, an AUP is in place to prohibit accessing and storing as well offensive content or inappropriate content. And so typically within an AUP, you're going to have various topics that are laid out and guidelines are provided. And these can include topics ranging from the basics of protecting an organization's computers and networks, managing passwords, managing software licenses, managing intellectual property, email etiquette, as well as the level of privacy an individual should expect when using an organization's computer or network. It can also involve non-compliance consequences to govern how individual should be dealt with if they violate the policy. And so a good AUP approach is going to ensure that employees are aware of the policy, and this can be accomplished through a number of different ways, such as required awareness training, as well as other realistic scenarios that can be utilized to help train an individual to be in compliance with the acceptable use policy for the company. So there are different situations in which these policies can apply. Another policy to consider is the privileged level access agreement. And so a PLAA is designed to heighten the awareness and accountability of users who have administrative rights. So a PAA is going to represent an agreement that is formal between appropriate stakeholders and the company administrator that provides an acknowledgement that appropriate administrative rights are in place. And so a PAA can be utilized as a way to enhance security principles and security policies within organization. And typically privilege level access agreement is not going to be a detailed or 10 or more page document. Typically it's less than 2 or 3 pages, and it'll contain appropriate sections to determine areas of high level of risk. And so at a general sense, the PAA will provide acknowledgments for the risk associated with elevated access in the event the credentials are breached or abused. It'll ask users to promise to use access only for approved organizational businesses. It'll ask users to promise not to attempt to hack or breach security. It will ask users to promise to protect any output from these credentials, such as reports, logs, files, and downloads as well. And so in many cases, this allows for the PAA to reinforce the importance of appropriate security terms with administrators. Another important policy to have in place is a security awareness policy. And security awareness is going to represent typical user information security principles. And so typically with the security awareness policy, it's going to be required by all new hires within a organization. And so it provides management with a first impression view of how employees should respond to security issues. And so a key benefit of a security awareness policy is that it lays out the basic principles of information security. It provides an awareness of risk and threats. It lets users know how to deal with unexpected risk. It tells users how to report suspicious activity, incidents, and breaches. It tells users how to build a culture that is security and risk aware. And so in these cases, security policy provides a governing law to help ensure that organizations maintain appropriate security policies that can be utilized effectively to help to mitigate and rule out any risks that are likely to occur. And so there are various users that would be expected to take appropriate security awareness training. And so these users can consist of a number of different people. It could be all users who would need to be aware of essential security basics. It could be executives who would represent policy level and governance principles with regards to security. It could be program and functional managers. And so the program and functional managers can include security management, planning and implementation, and also risk management and contingency planning. Other actors include appropriate IT security managers that can handle board training as well. It can include auditors who can handle the board training and the security planning, system and application security management as well. And then you're also going to have the IT function management and operations personnel. And these are going to help supply broad training in security planning and system and application security management. So this provides for a number of different guidelines to be set forth to ensure that appropriate security awareness policies are in place for stakeholders within an organization. We can also further discuss some of the best practices that are associated with user domain policies. And so when we think about best practices, we want to keep in mind that we want to have them governed with a strong technique, methodology, and technology that is reliable to ensure user domain policies are supported. And so the user domain policy should have specific guidelines and practices in place to handle various components. So this can include attachments, and in that we never want to open an email attachment from a source that is not trusted. We also need to make appropriate considerations when it comes to encryption. When dealing with encryption, we want to always encrypt sensitive data that leaves the confines of a secure server. We also need to have appropriate mechanism in place that will be useful to establish a layered defense. And with a layered defense, what we want to do is be able to provide an approach that establishes various layers of security that are all overlapping to provide for a maximum range of protection. We also need to consider dealing with least privilege, and the principle of least privilege essentially says that individuals should only have access to perform their responsibilities. And so with this approach, it is taking an approach of having users only have the most basic level of access to appropriate components. Another consideration is patch management, and patch management focuses on making sure that all network devices have the latest security patches. We also need to be sure to deal with unique identity, and that we want all users that are accessing system information be able to access it using unique credentials. We want to ensure that everyone has unique credentials so that if there is any type of security violation, then we want to be able to trace back to what was the cause of that violation. We also want to make sure that we have appropriate virus protection in place. With virus protection, we want to ensure that virus and malware software is installed on all system devices to ensure that security breaches are kept to a minimal. So these are some specific guidelines on some best practices to be considered when dealing with user domain policies. It's also important to be able to understand least access privileges and best fit access privileges. So let's discuss some of the differences between least access privileges and best fit access privileges. These can be a little bit confusing, but it can be pretty subtle to tell the difference. The difference is that least privileges customize accesses to the individual, whereas best fit privileges will typically customize access to a group or class of users. So we could think of this in an example in that if we have 4 accounts receivable specialists, we can have a accounts receivable team, and they typically are going to collect on invoices due to the company. If we have 4 specialists, then we can have 2 work on commercial accounts and 2 work on individual accounts. So their access is going to be the same, except that the commercial account specialists will need to have access to market information, which relates to the companies that they serve. Under least privileges, we would choose to limit access to market information to just a commercial receivable specialist. And therefore, the specialists that work on the individual accounts would not require that same access. So there have been various case studies that have been done as well to explore various ways to apply these policies in an appropriate manner. And so these cases can vary. One case involved was with NASA, in which one of a government laptop that contained personal information of more than 10,000 employees was stolen. This was a violation of an acceptable use policy, as well as an inadequate security policy. We also had another example at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where an undetected Raspberry Pi attack resulted in the theft of over 500 megabytes of data. And this was a violation for the lack of proper device management policies and or enforcement of such policies. And then another critical infrastructure compromise occurred with the Navy contractor when a Chinese government-backed hackers were able to steal a wide range of data, which include anti-ship missile data and over 600 gigabytes of classified material. So this was a violation because the data was stored on unclassified computers, and thus the data classification policies were not being followed. And the Pentagon's Inspector General's office began reviewing contractor cybersecurity issues. So these are just a couple of different problems that can arise without having appropriate user domain policies in place. So throughout this lesson, we've explored understanding appropriate guidelines for developing user domain policies. Specifically, we have touched on having in place appropriate reasons for governing users with policies. We've spoken about regular and privileged users. We discussed having in place acceptable use policy and privilege level access agreements. We've discussed security awareness policies, as well as the differences between public and private user domain policies. These are all important considerations to keep in mind, as security policies are an effective way to reduce risk and govern users. If we have the effective security policies in place, then we're able to identify high-risk activities and minimize any negative effects that they can have on the organization as well as our technological networks. It's important to keep in mind these core concepts to ensure that least access privileges and best fit access privileges are in place as well.